Hello everyone. My name is Madison Chartier, and today I will be presenting my article titled The Ongoing Quest for Culturally Responsive Assessment for Indigenous Students in the U.S. by Trumbull and Nelson Barber. This article explores how assessment practices can better reflect students' cultural backgrounds and experiences, particularly for Indigenous students, and why culturally responsive assessment is essential for creating equitable learning opportunities. Assessment plays a major role in education because it influences instructional decisions, identifies student strengths and needs, and can even affect special education referrals. However, traditional assessments are often designed from a dominant cultural perspective. When students come from different cultural or linguistic backgrounds, those assessments may not accurately represent what they know or can do. Culturally responsive assessment seeks to reduce those barriers by recognizing students' experiences and providing fairer ways to measure learning. The article one selected is The Ongoing Quest for Culturally Responsive Assessment for Indigenous Students in the U.S., published in 2019 by Trumbull and Nelson Barber. It is a research-based review that focuses on three main topics: culturally responsive educational assessment, assessment practices for Indigenous students, and reducing cultural bias in schools. Rather than conducting a new experiment, the authors reviewed existing research to better understand current assessment practices and recommendations. The purpose of this article was to examine how traditional assessments can unintentionally create barriers for Indigenous students. The authors wanted to understand how cultural differences influence assessment outcomes, and why assessments should better reflect students' cultural knowledge, experiences, and ways of demonstrating learning. Ultimately, the goal was to encourage educators to move toward more equitable assessment practices. The authors used a research review methodology. They analyzed previous studies on Indigenous education, assessment practices, and culturally responsive approaches. Since this was a literature review, there were no new participants. Instead, the researchers examined findings from existing studies involving Indigenous students and communities to identify common themes and recommendations. The researchers found several important points. First, traditional assessments may not accurately represent Indigenous students' abilities because they often reflect only one cultural perspective. Second, differences in communication styles, language, and ways of demonstrating knowledge can influence assessment results. Finally, the authors emphasized that teachers should consider students' cultural backgrounds when interpreting assessment data, rather than relying solely on standardized test scores. One major topic discussed in the article is cultural bias. Assessments can create barriers when they reflect dominant cultural values or assume that every student has similar life experiences. Students may also struggle if the language, examples, or context used in an assessment are unfamiliar to them. Because of this, a single assessment may not accurately show everything a student knows or understands. According to the article, culturally responsive assessment means recognizing students' cultural backgrounds, experiences, and languages throughout the assessment process. It also means giving students multiple ways to demonstrate what they know and using assessment results to better support learning instead of simply assigning a score. Overall, this approach creates more equitable opportunities for all learners. One practical strategy teachers can use is providing multiple ways for students to demonstrate understanding. Instead of relying only on written tests, students could show their learning through presentations, projects, discussions, demonstrations, or visual representations. For example, a student who struggles with written language may be able to clearly explain their thinking during an oral presentation. Offering different assessment formats allows teachers to better recognize students' strengths while still assessing the same learning expectations. A second strategy is to consider students' cultural backgrounds when interpreting assessment results. Teachers should avoid making important decisions based on one test score alone. Instead, they should gather information from multiple assessment methods, learn about students' experiences, and consider whether language or cultural differences may have influenced performance. Using multiple sources of evidence leads to more accurate and equitable decisions. This article has important implications for special education. Culturally responsive assessment can help educators more accurately identify student needs and reduce the possibility of misidentifying students because of cultural or linguistic differences. It also supports the development of meaningful IEP goals and encourages stronger partnerships with families by considering the whole child during the assessment process. As future educators, it is important that we use assessment to understand students rather than simply evaluate them. One quote that stood out to me is, "Assessment should help us understand students, not limit our understanding of them." This article reminded me that assessment is much more than assigning grades. As teachers, we have a responsibility to recognize each student's unique experiences, strengths, and cultural background. By using culturally responsive assessment practices, we can create classrooms that are more inclusive, equitable, and supportive for every learner. In conclusion, culturally responsive assessment helps educators reduce cultural bias, better understand student abilities, and create more equitable learning environments. The goal of assessment should not simply be to measure learning, but to support student growth and ensure every learner has the opportunity to demonstrate what they know in meaningful ways. Thank you for listening.